What motivated Poland to take on the Wehrmacht in a one-sided war? They were under the illusion that Anglo-French forces would attack immediately in the west, where, in comparison to the Eastern Front, the German army was spread thinly. This would result, as they supposed, in German troops being transferred from the east to reinforce the Western Front. They also set great store on information from France, implying that within the first 3 days of war, a coup in Germany would eject Hitler and clear the way to Berlin for the Poles. The source of these reports was German resistance circles, to which both France and Poland attached undue importance. We did not learn of this until the discovery of Polish ministerial files some weeks later, supplemented in 1940 by state documents seized in France. The Poles were not equipped for modern war. They had 36 infantry and 2 mountain divisions and 1 mountain, 1 motorised and 11 cavalry brigades, but lacked armour and artillery. Against them, the German army ranged more than 50 divisions, including 6 panzer and 4 motorised, a clear superiority. The Polish Air Force was not an independent arm, and its 900 aircraft, roughly half modern and half obsolescent, were distributed amongst army units. The military leadership was good, and some groups fought on doggedly in ignorance of the overall situation. To the mass of the German people, the attack on Poland was no more than the means of rectifying the Versailles Diktat. War began for Germany with the British and French declarations on 3rd of September 1939. During the first 3 days of war, the Führerhauptquartier, FHQ, came into being. Its infrastructure remained virtually unchanged from beginning to end. Hitler was accompanied by 2 personal ADCs, usually Bruckner, SA, and Schaub, SS, 2 female secretaries, 2 manservants, attendant physician Dr. Karl Brandt, representing Professor von Hasselbach, 4 military ADCs, Schmundt, Puttkamer, Engel, and myself, and 3 liaison officers, Bodenschatz, Luftwaffe, Wolf, SS, and Admiral Voss. The Wehrmacht High Command, OKW, controlled the military planning staff headed by Keitel. Jodl was head of the Wehrmacht Command Staff, BUFS, throughout the war. The relationship between Hitler and the Army High Command, OKH, was fluid. At the outbreak of war, there existed a certain tension, primarily to do with personnel appointments, and which had its origins in 1938. For example, OKH had given Blaskowitz the 8th Army, when Hitler considered him unqualified for anything greater than overseeing motorization. In the case of Kluge, Hitler had allowed himself to be influenced by Goering, who had repeatedly clashed with Kluge about the latter's outspoken opinions and public remarks on military matters. But OKH prevailed against Hitler, and Kluge was given command of the 4th Army, whose task was to advance through a section of the Polish corridor to reach the Vistula. Hitler quickly gained a good impression of Kluge and was very upset when he had to be replaced following a flying accident on 4th of September. The key to the Polish operation was Reichenau's 10th Army. With his panzers and motorized divisions, he was instructed to spearhead the attack through Silesia towards Warsaw. In the preliminary discussions, Hitler had suggested that he look neither right nor left, but look only forwards towards his goal. To protect his flanks, he had List's 14th Army to the south, and Blaskowitz's 8th Army to the north. Blaskowitz was also intent on reaching Warsaw as soon as possible. Therefore, Blaskowitz and Reichenau were both looking only forwards. When a Polish division broke out of the Posen area, a dangerous situation threatened for some hours until General von Briesen's 30th Infantry Division made a left turn and stopped the thrust. Von Briesen was wounded during the engagement. Hitler reproached Blaskowitz sternly for his negligence. In the event, the quick victories bridged all differences and prevented serious crises. Hitler distanced himself from command during the Polish campaign. A train in sidings at Lower Pomerania and later Upper Silesia served as his HQ. He was confident of success and expected at any moment a sign from the Poles that they wanted to give in and negotiate surrender on fair Rest Poland terms. In his Reichstag speech of 1st September, he had said that the purpose of the war was to resolve the questions of Danzig and the Polish corridor. This would bring about change in the relationship between Germany and Poland to assure peaceful coexistence. Thus, he was ready to negotiate. For their part, the Poles fought on bravely in every sector, but without prospect of success. They had almost no telephone links. The various fronts trusted blindly in London's promise of relief as soon as possible. On 17th of September, the Polish government abandoned Warsaw and set up in Romania. This was the signal for Hitler to annex to the Reich those parts of Poland which had been German possessions until 1918, and cede the area east of the Naro-Vistula San line to the Soviets. The remainder would be run from Krakow by a general government under Reichsleiter Hans Frank. That same day, Soviet forces swarmed through eastern Poland as far as the line agreed with Ribbentrop. As the German army was already beyond this line in its advance eastwards, there was a great deal of annoyance at having to give up the territory won. Hitler remarked frequently at this time that the British guarantees made to Poland in March and August 1939 were the best possible proof that Britain had engineered the war in order to get rid of him. And, as in 1914, they had done it in such a manner as to taint Germany with the guilt. On 19th September, Hitler took quarters in the Casino Hotel at Zopo, from where he was driven that afternoon to Danzig. The jubilation and size of the crowds were unbelievable. After being welcomed in the Artushof by Gauleiter Forster, Hitler delivered a long, unscripted reply in which he announced the annexation of Danzig into the Reich. I had the impression that much of what he said was for British consumption. For example, for the warmongers, Poland was only a means to an end. This war was not about the existence of Poland, but about the removal of the German regime. Or, if Poland chose war, then they chose it because others were mongering in it. To his enemies in the West, he said, "I have no war aims as regards Britain and France," and concluded, since the aim of Britain is not just war against a regime, but war against the German people, against German women and children, our response will be the same. And at the end, one thing will be certain. This Germany will never capitulate. During our stay in Zopo, Hitler concentrated his attention on the battle for Warsaw. He observed that the city's commander was still waiting for the assistance of the Western states. On 21st September, he had accepted Hitler's offer to allow the evacuation of the entire diplomatic corps and all foreign nationals from the city. They were led north of Warsaw by representatives of the German Foreign Office and escorted to Königsberg. Warsaw now prepared itself for the final battle. Diplomatic reports stated that very remarkable signals had been received from the West. The French were said to have made a substantial incursion into southern Germany, and all work in the Ruhr had stopped. No doubt, this was intended to give a little more backbone to the commander in his defence of the city. The artillery bombardment began on 21st September, and the Luftwaffe was ordered to start air raids. On the 22nd, Hitler was flown around the outskirts of Warsaw to observe the effects. In close vicinity to the spot where the former army CNC Fritsch had been mortally wounded, he was informed of the general's death, and, although making no comment, was visibly affected. Driving along the highway that day, I was appalled at the large number of refugees fleeing the area. Most were younger people and many Jews. On 25 September, Hitler flew again to the Warsaw Theatre, and from a good vantage point watched the attack ordered for that day by OKH. Many parts of the city were ablaze. It highlighted how useless resistance was. 2 days later, the city's commander surrendered, and the last Polish forces capitulated on 1st October on the Gila Peninsula. During the campaign, the Luftwaffe developed a style of attack which remained decisive until the end of 1941. On the first 2 days of war, the Polish airfields had been laid waste and the mass of aircraft destroyed, enabling the German army to manoeuvre across Poland, unmolested by air attack. The Luftwaffe supported the army's advance with complete aerial supremacy, and in this way there developed a close inter-service cooperation which was to be the foundation for the successes of the next 2 years. Service in our adjutanter now reverted to a steady routine centred on the daily situation conferences with Jodl or the Army General Staff. These talks convened every day at 12 and usually lasted for up to 2 hours. The evening discussions, mostly around 6 or 7, were on a lesser scale. Jodl would sum up the current situation, and if, as in the quiet periods between campaigns in 1939 and 1941, there was nothing special to report, the adjutants of each branch of service would then deliver a brief closing summary. The morning update was central, for here Hitler discussed all events and measures and made known his thoughts and instructions regarding future operations. Until the autumn of 1941, it was rare for him to give a direct order. His preferred method was persuasion, so that his generals put his ideas into effect from conviction. This persuasion was also the reason for the often protracted conversations with Hitler. Even after December 1941, when Hitler took over command of the army, he still attempted to win over his listeners by argument. Only in the final year of the war, when the possibilities of putting across his ideas were so limited, did he make more use of direct commands. During the Polish campaign, I had the opportunity to appreciate Hitler's sharp logic and extraordinary fine feel for military situations. He was very good at putting himself in the enemy's shoes, and his military judgment was balanced and accurate, whereas in the political field he was something of a visionary, but prey to wishful thinking. After the fall of Poland, the enthusiasm throughout the ranks divided the army leadership. The OKH leaders, Brauchitsch and Halder, were isolated and could expect no support for their designs to have Hitler removed. Thus, although both were inwardly opposed to Hitler's plans and ideas, they went along with him in the hope that, somewhere along the way, the opportunity to strike would present itself. But it never did. In my conversations with Hitler from September 1939 onwards, I noticed his anxiety to understand the thinking of the OKH generals. He knew that he had amongst them a few enemies. He did not have this worry with the Luftwaffe or Navy. Under Brauchitsch, the army continued to follow its own path, and this Hitler wanted to change. He was unsuccessful, and in any case, his criticism of the General Staff and Army Officer Corps was based on a false premise. Driven by his own will to succeed, he expected too much of them, and was disappointed and surprised by their mediocre quality, as he once expressed it to me. Following the victory over Poland, I was often asked who advised Hitler on his war policies. People heard that there was an atmosphere of servility, nervousness, and self-consciousness in his presence. I will not deny that an outsider who had made a report to Hitler once or twice might be under this impression. In the daily round of situation conferences, there was a more or less fixed agenda where it was only possible for the individual to put his viewpoint in respect of the particular matter under discussion. Hitler discussed special questions and problems in private talks with a limited personal circle. Early in the war, many visitors calling to make reports, mostly older, inwardly antagonistic general staff officers, were self-conscious and uncertain. At that time, I knew nothing of a broad active opposition to Hitler, but it is understandable that an officer with a foot in two camps might sweat a little, particularly if Hitler went into details and asked a few searching questions which could not be answered, and then he would recount later to his personal circle how perfectly frightful it had been to be made to discuss military matters with a person like Hitler, who after all had had no general staff training. I listened to this sort of thing several times, but Hitler's questions were really quite normal and not extraordinary at all. Generally, they simply sought details omitted from a report, but which Hitler considered important for the overall picture. During the Polish campaign, when he went to the command coach to receive Jodl's morning report, Hitler's first question would be, "Anything on the Western Front?" And Jodl always reassured him that nothing whatever was happening on the Western Front. For some time, Hitler had been considering plans for a swift campaign against France, And so it did not surprise me when Schmundt stated so openly on 8th of September. The matter was discussed frequently with his military advisors. The date they had been given was October or November. Hitler did not think it likely that Britain or France would sue for peace after the fall of Poland, and he was convinced that Britain in particular would remain belligerent. Hitler's intention was to overwhelm France, and thus convince Britain that the war against Germany was pointless. On 26 September, Hitler returned by train to Berlin, and next afternoon summoned Göring, Raeder, Brauchitsch, Keitel, Jodl, Halder, Jeschonnek, and Bodenschatz to the new Reich Chancellery. We military ADCs were also present at this conference, the purpose of which was to discuss the attack on France. OKH had made known its disfavour about this, and it was not surprising when Hitler launched into a comprehensive lecture. The victory over Poland had changed the world's opinion of Germany, he said. The great majority of neutral states trembled before us. The major powers saw in us a great danger. The Polish campaign had increased their fears and respect. Throughout the world there was no love for Germany. Britain would attempt to agitate further against us. Therefore, we had to reckon with a continuation of the war. Time was not on our side. In 6 months, Britain and France would be better placed than now. Britain would have raised many divisions, perhaps not combat-worthy, but at least suitable for resistance. The Panzers and the Luftwaffe had been the key to our success in Poland. Today, the West was poorly equipped in this respect. In 6 months, it would probably be different. If they had had the weapons, they would have been able to help Poland. It was erroneous to delay our attack in the West. If we were forced into trench warfare, we would have to rely on the Luftwaffe and U-boats for victory. We could quickly make good our minimal losses in Poland. It was essential to transfer as many units as possible to the Western Front. The quality was not decisive. The attack was no more difficult than that against the Poles. The decisive factor was the weather during the first 3 or 4 days. Between 20 and 25th of October, the attack should be made with the objective of striking a death blow to the enemy. The war aim was to force Britain to her knees. These were Hitler's words. He was totally convinced that a swift attack in the West would be successful. On 28th September, Ribbentrop returned to Moscow for the signing of the German-Soviet Border and Friendship Treaty. This border was the Bug River. The eastern Baltic states had been gifted to Russia. Hitler had given his assent without long deliberation, but had made public the general political declaration of the Reich government and the Soviet government, which contained the observation that it would be in the interests of all peoples to put an end to the present state of war between Germany on the one hand and Britain and France on the other. Should, however, the efforts of our two governments be unsuccessful, that very fact would determine the responsibility of Britain and France for the continuation of the war. The German press made a big thing of this declaration, but Hitler doubted that it would budge Britain. The earliest possible attack on France remained his priority, while Poland would be the springboard for a future military adventure. Therefore, the latter's road, rail and communications networks were to be maintained, and the Polish economy could continue as before. On 5th of October, Hitler flew to Warsaw, where he was met at the airfield by Brauchitsch, Blaskowitz and Reichenau, and later took the salute at the march past of the 8th Army. The parade lasted 2 hours. It was the only occasion when he did this in the capital city of a conquered nation. After visiting Belvedere Castle, the former seat of the late Marshal Pilsudski, he returned to Berlin. Next day he addressed the Reichstag, describing the course of the Polish campaign and highlighting the achievement and fighting spirit of the fighting forces, the quick victories and the few casualties. In conclusion, he spoke extensively about the political situation in Europe. There was no reason for the war to be continued, he said. It solved no problem in the West. He made suggestions for humanitarian arrangements and suggested the abolition of certain weapons and the prohibition of air attacks against civilian targets. But one could detect his suspicion of Britain, At the end of his speech, he left the decision in the hands of the British government. Should his suspicions be confirmed, we would fight. Not for a second did he doubt that Germany would triumph. Finally, he offered thanks to God for having blessed us so wonderfully in the first major struggle for our right, and prayed that he allow us and all others to find the right path where it falls not only to the German people, but to all Europe, to find a new happiness in peace. This speech was not without its effect on the mass of the people. They trusted in the Führer and believed, contrary to Hitler's thinking, that Britain and France would be sensible. Hitler never doubted Britain's commitment to war and concentrated his mental energies totally on the imminent attack in the West. On 9th of October, he issued to the Wehrmacht Directive No. 6, ordering the preparation of an attack on the northern flank of the Western Front through the Luxembourg, Charge, Belgian and Dutch areas as powerfully and early as possible. How serious Hitler was about the need to fight immediately can be seen from his discussion document of 10th of October addressed to senior Wehrmacht commanders, in which he stated unequivocally that the German war aim must be the final military annihilation of the West. Regarding the Soviet Union, he stated, "No treaty or agreement can ensure for certain the lasting neutrality of Soviet Russia. For the present, reason militates against their abandoning this neutrality. In 8 months, in a year, maybe in several years, this can change." With these words, he made known to his generals his attitude to the treaty with Soviet Russia. As early as 10th of September, Hitler had been completely surprised when the Kriegsmarine CNC Ryder made plain the importance of Norway in a naval war, primarily with regard to protecting the iron ore shipments from the port of Narvik. Raeder considered the implications so serious that he recommended the occupation of Norway. Hitler asked Raeder to have the Naval War Office, SKL, send him the files, but the matter was not raised again until the outbreak of the Russo-Finnish War on 30th of November. In early October, at Raeder's suggestion, Hitler visited U-boat crews at Wilhelmshaven. Several submarines were in harbour there after having made their first war patrols. It was Raeder's intention that Hitler should gain a deeper understanding of the U-boat arm's main purpose, the war against enemy trade. The Führer der U-Boote, Dönitz, outlined events to date in a brief address, and, after inspecting the crews, many of them still unkempt, Hitler invited the officers to give detailed accounts of their experiences. One of them was Schuhart, whose boat U-29 had sunk the aircraft carrier Courageous on 17th September. Hitler returned to Berlin with an excellent impression. On 14th October, the British Admiralty admitted the sinking of the battleship Royal Oak by a U-boat inside Scapa Flow, an audacious achievement about which Hitler was so enthusiastic that he summoned the Moirme, commander and crew of U-47, to the Chancellery, where he decorated Prien with the Knight's Cross. Hitler's preoccupation was to be at the Channel by late autumn, after having broken the French will to fight. This would preempt whatever was being schemed in London and Paris. The revised date for the attack against France, Belgium and Holland was 12th of November. He authorised Brauchitsch and Halder to proceed with the operational plan. By now he had fresh ideas, but time had run out for fundamental changes. On 16 and 27 of October, OKH attempted to dissuade him. Brauchitsch and Halder asserted that the divisions which had been victorious in Poland were not sufficiently suitable for battle in the West. On 5th of November, Brauchitsch met Hitler alone and supplied him with a memorandum tabling current army weaknesses. In the course of the ensuing conversation, Hitler began to put the counter-argument so forcefully that Brauchitsch fell silent. Hitler pointed out that the troops were trained to the same standard as 4 weeks before. The weather might be unfavourable in the spring. The truth was that OKH did not want to fight. All this talk of working up was for delay. Hitler was shocked and annoyed at Brauchitsch, and even mentioned it to me. He made no secret that Brauchitsch and Halder would have to be replaced, but it could not be done now, shortly before a new offensive. On 7th November, OKH asked for Hitler's confirmation of the 12th as X-Day. Before the main situation conference, Dr. Diesing, the senior Luftwaffe meteorologist, delivered a weather prognosis so miserable that Hitler was forced to postpone his decision to the 9th. This would follow his return from Munich, where he had a speech to make on the evening of the 8th. His speech at the Bürgerbräukeller had only one subject: Britain. I was awoken that evening to receive a telephone call. A bomb had gone off at the party meeting, but Hitler had already left the cellar. The device had been concealed beneath the central pillar. So now we knew that Hitler had enemies who would go to any lengths to get rid of him. It was noticeable the following morning, on his return to the Chancellery, that the incident had affected him. He accepted our wishes of good luck calmly, and declared it a miracle that he had been spared. It was a sure sign of the mission he had been given as head of the Reich. It was reported from Munich that 8 people had been killed and over 60 injured. Hitler took a lively interest in the condition of the survivors and wounded. 3 days later, when he went back to Munich for the Feldherrenhalle political ceremony, he visited the injured in hospital and was obviously moved when shown over the demolished cellar at the Bürgerbräukeller. The criminal investigation later showed that Georg Elser, a 36-year-old cabinet maker arrested at the Swiss frontier, had probably acted alone. In the large situation room, a relief map of the territory west of the German border had been pinned up, and throughout October, Hitler spent a great deal of time contemplating this map and meditating on his offensive. After supper, when previously it had been his custom to watch a film, he would return to the situation room with the duty military ADCs for hour-long conversations about all aspects of the proposed invasion. These conversations were little more than a soliloquy, and we ADCs were the sounding board for his ideas. He studied the roads, rivers, and other obstructions to troop movements, and as the weeks went by, it became increasingly clear to him that his main thrust must be through the Ardennes towards the Sedan-Rouen axis. On 30th October, while juggling an extra panzer and motorised division to the Aalen-Sedan line, no more than a tactical strengthening of von Rundstedt's Army Group B, he saw the advantage of amassing his panzers. When the weather situation caused a further postponement of X-Day, Hitler revised his plans completely. On 11 October, OKH telexed Army Groups A and B, advising them that the Führer had ordered the formation of a mobile armoured group, which, using open stretches of country either side of Aalen, Tintigny and Florenville, would bear down on Sedan. In Directive No. 8 of 20th November, Hitler ordered the weight of the attack transferred from Army Group B to Army Group A. Jodl then discussed the document with the General Staff. As a rule, the latter were not inclined to follow Hitler's directives too strictly, and the various points were translated into orders only slowly. In any case, the first operational plan was still in force, and was being postponed at regular intervals for periods of from 6 to 8 days. At this time, Hitler was not aware of Manstein's ideas, which coincided very closely with his own. In November, the BBC broadcast a very aggressive speech by Churchill, in which he likened Hitler to a criminal lunatic and promised that if Britain and France were defeated, all Europe would be enslaved, leaving the United States to fight on alone. Churchill was looking to his future. He was not yet Prime Minister, but he knew that in due course the war would dictate that he receive the reins of power. On 23rd November, considering it necessary to elucidate his most recent understanding of the general situation, Hitler summoned Göring, Raeder, Brauchitsch, the Army Group and Army CNCs, all with their senior commanders, together with their Navy and Luftwaffe counterparts. He began by reviewing the development of his own career from 1919 through 1923 until the seizure of power in 1933. Since then, he had built up the Wehrmacht to strike, he said. First, he had been compelled to find a solution in the east. The superiority of the Wehrmacht had brought a swift success in Poland. For the moment, the Soviet Union was not dangerous, but Stalin would only observe our common treaty for as long as it suited him. We could only move against Russia once we were free in the West. the Russian armed forces would remain inferior for 1 to 2 years. Italy under Mussolini was a positive factor for us. His death would be dangerous for Germany. Italy would not enter the war until Germany began her offensive against France. The Italian court was anti-German. Hitler deemed the United States still no threat to us. Of Japan he was uncertain. It was not even known if she would be hostile to Britain. Time works for the enemy. The ratio of might can only deteriorate against us. I will attack and not capitulate. The fate of the Reich depends on me alone. British rearmament was beginning only now, he continued. Its first phase would not be complete for 1 to 2 years. The French fighting forces were far inferior to ours. Germany had superiority, and the millions of Germans now in the armed forces were outstanding. Everything lay in the hands of the military leaders, and behind the army stood the greatest armaments industry in the world. It impressed him that the British were beginning to loom large. They were tough opponents. In 6 to 8 months, they would be in France with greatly increased forces. Holland and Belgium would be on their side. They were waiting only for mutual support before invading the Ruhr. The outcome of the war depended on who held the Ruhr. It was important for us to have better bases from which to strike. Flights over England were currently too costly in fuel. That could only be changed by occupying the Low Countries. It is a difficult decision for me. I must choose between victory and defeat. I choose victory. Hitler now declared his decision to attack France and Britain at the earliest opportunity. He dismissed Belgian and Dutch neutrality as meaningless. He saw the military conditions as favourable, but it was a precondition that the higher leadership should give an example of fanatical determination. If the people's leaders had always had the courage which the simple rifleman had to have, there would never have been failure. It is for the nation a question of to be or not to be. I implore you to pass on to your men the spirit of resolution. I will stand or fall in this struggle. I will not survive the defeat of my people. Outwardly, no capitulation. Inwardly, no revolution. During the late afternoon, Hitler had another serious talk with Brauchitsch. He considered it essential to win him over. The latter asked the Führer to relieve him of office if he was thought lacking. Hitler declined and reminded Brauchitsch of the need for every soldier to remain at his post. After the evening meal, Hitler took me into the large situation room, where we walked the length of the room together. He wanted to speak his thoughts aloud in order to detect errors in his planning. He repeated his criticism of Brauchitsch and Halder and condemned their negative attitude to the Western offensive. The 100 German divisions coming to readiness in the next few months are at present superior to those of Britain and France. In 6 months that can change, Hitler said. This was his main concern, for he did not know the rate at which his two enemies were rearming. In spring 1940, he needed the army free for a great operation in the east against Russia. This was the first I had heard of the idea. It seemed utopian, but apparently the plan had been long thought out, and soon the Wehrmacht would be asked to fulfill it. On 29 November, diplomatic relations were broken off between Russia and Finland. Hitler shook his head. He considered it impossible that Finland could hold out against Soviet forces. Diplomats in Moscow and Helsinki were instructed to send regular detailed reports. He read everything the press turned out on the subject and watched cinema newsreels, trying to form a picture of what was going on, although the material supplied was scanty and allowed no conclusions to be drawn. Naturally, his sympathies were with the Finns, but he was forced to remember how he was bound to neutrality by the non-aggression pact with Russia. On 12th of December, there was an important conference, about which Naval Adjutant Puttkamer put me in the picture. In discussing the Scandinavian problem, Hitler and Raeder had agreed that support for Finland should not go through unreliable Sweden. It was important that Russia had a show of German neutrality. Raeder also reported on his talks with the Norwegian fascist leader Vidkun Quisling, OKH considered control of the Norwegian ports indispensable. Hitler accepted this and agreed to talks with Quisling to form an impression of him. The two met a few days later in the Chancellery, but Hitler made no decision. As 1939 drew to a close, the situation in the West remained unclear. Hitler had not yet abandoned his plan to embark upon a winter offensive against France, but on the 12th of December, Thanksgiving Day was put back to 1st January 1940. On 27th of December, even the setting of a new date was deferred until 9th of January. Hitler spent Christmas with his troops in the West. On 23rd December, he visited a reconnaissance unit near Limburg bei den Lahn, passing the afternoon with the Grossdeutschland Infantry Regiment, and the evening with the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, where he made a short speech. The following day, 24th of December, he lunched with a heavy battery in the flak zone, before moving on to the Spitzerer Höhen between the French and German lines, where he was shown, to his great interest, a trench complex. Hitler was hailed as the liberator of the former German territories in Poland and West Prussia. For the coming encounter in the West, his forces were sure of victory and eager to move. Some of the higher staff on the Western Front would not have shared this confidence. Hitler exuded calmness and certainty. Doubt simply did not enter into it. In the brief talk he made at each location, he emphasized that the 1939 successes proved the superiority of the German Wehrmacht. The weather was very depressing, the thermometer usually hovering around 0 degrees, and a thin mist lay, motionless over the whole landscape. Hitler recognized this and made a distinct attempt to raise the mood. It was dark when he returned to his railway coach. On Christmas Day, he called in on the newly reformed regiment list before his special train returned him to Berlin. After receiving an update on the army's plans on 27th December, he left Berlin in the company of Schmundt to spend a few days in Munich, followed by New Year at the Obersalzberg, where he looked forward to a quiet fortnight, thinking about the Western Front. The New Year began quietly. The bad weather persisted. A thick mist continued to shroud the whole country. On 3rd of January, Hitler read a long letter from Mussolini, suggesting that Hitler take the lead in the restoration of the Polish state and refrain from attacking in the West. The Italian leader also objected to the friendship with the Soviet Union, which remained Europe's greatest threat. I did not see Hitler's immediate reaction to this letter, but I gathered that it annoyed him. He did not reply to it, and, although he had not seen Mussolini since May 1938, saw no reason to meet him now. What the letter did prove to him was the Italian government's bias towards Britain and France. Early on the 7th of January, Hitler requested a weather report. The meteorologist indicated the possibility of an improvement from the east. He could provide better details tomorrow. Hitler postponed his decision until then. A high-pressure system of unusual permanence was promised. On the 12th and 13th it would cloud over, but this would be followed by 12 to 14 days of clear winter weather, with temperatures of 10 degrees Celsius to 15 degrees Celsius over the European mainland. X-Day was now 17th in January. Should the improvement not materialise, the attack would be put off to the spring. There was a tense mood in the Chancellery. In the afternoon, Brauchitsch and Halder came. On the 12th or 13th, the Luftwaffe would soften up some airfields in the north of France. January 11th was a black day. On a flight from Fliegerführer 220, Münster, to a conference at Fliegerkorps Vannes, Cologne, the pilot lost his bearings and, being low on fuel, made an emergency landing near Mechlin in Belgium. He had a courier aboard, and this officer had in his attaché case a plan showing the troop deployments for X-Day. Hitler received the news impassively and deferred any action until it was known what documents had fallen into Belgian hands. The German military attaché in Brussels reported that all papers had been destroyed, but Hitler was sceptical. After a few days, a new story suggested that the courier had been interrupted while trying to burn the documents. Both he and the pilot had been captured and taken to a Belgian military barracks, where a second unsuccessful attempt was made to set the documents alight. The Belgians accordingly took possession of the plans, which they passed without further ado to the French General Staff. Hitler remained calm. As Luftwaffe chief, Göring ultimately bore responsibility for the mishap, but inwardly Hitler was fuming. After dinner on 11th January, in conversation with the duty military ADCs, Hitler spoke frankly about the negligent manner in which the most secret files were handled by the Luftwaffe. The event prompted Hitler to issue immediately his Basic Order No. 1, which stated that no aspect of a state secret was to be divulged unless absolutely essential on military grounds. It was also forbidden to pass on publications, orders, and reports of significant importance without due consideration. The order was to be hung in all military offices and orderly rooms. The fog persisted. The Luftwaffe could not be guaranteed 3 consecutive days flying weather, and the enemy had a copy of the current troop deployment plan for the offensive in the west. For these reasons, Hitler abandoned the attack for the time being. In any case, he had resolved to amass his panzers for a surprise thrust through the Ardennes to the Meuse between Dinant and Sedan, from where the force would stream out to the mouth of the Somme. The Mechon affair had made up his mind for him, and he forced through his radical new idea, despite all the obstacles OKH put in his way. In the Sportpalast on 24th January, Hitler addressed 7,000 subalterns. It was in the previous year that he had initiated the custom of lecturing the most junior officers on the European situation. This Europe, he told them, managed by the grace of Britain and France, refuses to grant us the right to exist. No matter what restrictions we become subject to, we will never satisfy France and Britain. If this struggle for my people cannot be avoided, it is my will absolutely to carry it through in my lifetime. He reaped a noticeably greater ovation from his young listeners than in the year before. On 30th January, he stood again on the podium at the Sportpalast. In peacetime, the anniversary of the seizure of power had always been marked by a Hitler speech to the Reichstag. But this year, he addressed the German people directly. He received a tremendous reception, and during his speech there was repeated evidence of enthusiasm. Of Britain, he spoke sharply. Herr Churchill burns with impatience for the second phase. Through his middlemen, and personally too, he hopes that at last the bombing war will begin. And they cry to the heavens that this war will not of course stop short at women and children. When did Britain ever stop short at women and children? The preparations for Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway and Denmark, came suddenly to the forefront when on 16th of February an incident occurred inside Norwegian territorial waters, which excited Hitler's interest and wrath. The German motor ship Altmark had been fired on and boarded in Usinfjord by the British destroyer Cossack. The tanker had been supply shipped to the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, which had been scuttled off Montevideo in mid-December and was carrying about 300 merchant seamen from sunken British steamers. On the final part of her voyage, she had been attempting to break through to Germany by way of the Norwegian Indraled. Hitler asked why Altmark had not resisted. On 21st February, Hitler received General von Falkenhorst, whom Jodl had recommended as suited to command the battle in Norway. Hitler gave him the task of planning the invasion. As the greatest secrecy was necessary, no official documents such as maps could be made available to him. Therefore, Falkenhorst bought a Baedeker's Guide to Norway, retired to a hotel room for a few hours, and presented Hitler with an outline plan the same afternoon. It was accepted. The terrain offered few variations. Hitler's main interest remained the offensive in the west, despite the pressure for Weserübung. The daily situation conferences with Keitel and Jodl often degenerated into involved conversations about the resistance to be expected on the French and Belgian borders. Hitler had had himself supplied with very detailed files about the frontier defences, individual forts and artificial obstructions, and on the basis of these reports he made his own plans for the attack. His suggestions and way of thinking brought Halder, when he was drawn into the discussion, to the brink of despair. Halder's view was that all this was a matter for the commanders and men on the spot, Whereas Hitler argued the need for the most important individual operations on the opening few days to be planned minutely in advance. The controversy gave rise to endless argument. A very important meeting took place between Hitler and Manstein, Rundstedt's chief of staff, in the Chancellery on the 17th February. Around the first of the month, Hitler's senior ADC, Schmundt, had paid a visit to Army Group A, where, during a long talk with Manstein and his adjutant Tresco, Schmundt had realised that the army group had very definite ideas, at variance with those of OKH, as to how the Western campaign should be conducted. Since the autumn, Manstein had sent papers to the General Staff on several occasions. Halder had rejected them with the assurance that the operation would be conducted in accordance with the OKH plan, and when Manstein persisted, Halder had him appointed commander of the new ECA Corps away from the front. This measure had caused some raised eyebrows, since it was unusual to replace an army group commander between campaigns. The OKH had said nothing of Manstein's opinions to Hitler. Schmundt was astonished at the similarity of views between Hitler and Manstein, and when he spoke to Hitler on his return, he found himself pushing at an open door. Halder's attitude did not surprise Hitler, and confirmed his suspicions. If only he had heard of Manstein's ideas earlier, while he, Hitler, was still toying with the concept. Instead, only a chance conversation on the occasion of Manstein's removal had brought it to light. Hitler pored over Manstein's plan. It coincided precisely with Hitler's own. The weight of the attack would fall to Army Group A with the massed panzers and motorised divisions. At once he ordered OKH to prepare the new plan. After Manstein had left, Hitler spoke harshly to Schmundt against Brauchitsch and Halder. Both wanted to sabotage his plans for the Western offensive. Already they had made the task extraordinarily difficult for him, he said. He did not want a change at OKH yet, but once the French were beaten, then he would sort them out. Shortly afterwards, Hitler's dissatisfaction with OKH received a fresh stimulus. He had heard complaints from various sources about the supply of weapons and ammunition to the army. The fault must lie with OKH, he believed. An aged staff set in its bureaucratic ways was responsible. Therefore, he considered it necessary to make a change. His antipathy towards OKH motivated him to appoint a civilian minister to oversee the new Reich Ministry for Armaments. Sweeping powers would revolutionize all centers into achieving the highest output. When the General Inspector of German Road Building, Dr. Fritz Todt, received the portfolio on the 17th of March, it hit the army like a bomb, and Todt had a big struggle on his hands to create and develop his office. In fact, he needed more than a year to establish the lines of communication to the various outposts of his large empire. On 24th February, we drove to Munich, where that evening Hitler addressed old party comrades in the Hofbräuhaus on the 20th anniversary of the proclamation of the party programme. His speech stood in the long shadow of the impending battle in the West, but he spoke frankly of the strong resistance which Britain would offer, and also mentioned the influence of the Jews. From the beginning of March, the US Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles, who, as President Roosevelt's special envoy, was touring the capitals of Europe, spoke with Goering, Ribbentrop, and Hess in Berlin. Hitler had prepared a guideline calling for the greatest caution in conversation. Sumner Welles should do the talking. The relationship between Germany and the United States was not good. If he had been sent with the intention of bringing about a better diplomatic climate, then that would be in the interests of the two peoples. Hitler wanted to emphasize the good relationship he had with Russia. He had made his last offer of peace to Britain and France in October, and in return had reaped only scorn. Not until the Anglo-French will to destroy Germany had been broken could one build a Europe at peace. The Reich was determined to end the war victoriously. Hitler received the US Special Envoy on 2nd and 4th of March in the presence of Ribbentrop, Meissner, head of the Chancellery, and the American Chargé d'Affaires, Alexander C. Kirk. On the 8th of March, Hitler dictated a very long letter to Mussolini explaining his stance on various questions. it was important for him to keep Italy on his side whilst Sumner was travelling through Europe. Ribbentrop delivered the letter in Rome on 10th March and satisfied himself that Sumner-Wells had not succeeded in influencing Mussolini. The Duke placed great value on talks with Hitler at the Brenner on 18th March. In the morning situation conference next day, Hitler gave Göring, Keitel and Jodl an almost rapturous account of the meeting. He was especially pleased that Mussolini wanted to keep his eggs in the German basket and was ready to commit his forces in the battle against France, although on this latter point Hitler seemed somewhat unconvinced. Hitler spent Easter at the Obersalzberg. I was duty ADC and flew from Tempelhof with my wife to the Einring airfield near Salzburg. We spent 4 very pleasant and relaxed days. Since the outbreak of war, Hitler had put a stop to his evening film show, and now he spent the evenings with guests around the fireplace at the Berghof Great Hall. The main topics were Mussolini and Hitler's architectural plans for Berlin and Munich. On Easter Monday, he had a long talk with Dr. Tott about armaments and the new ministry. I was drawn into the conversation on several occasions. His major concern was the OKH. He spent one whole evening discussing plans for field weapons. He considered an anti-tank weapon as a variant of the 8.8mm flak gun as most important. The production of panzers and panzer guns with long barrels occupied him intensely. These conversations often lasted 2 to 3 hours while his guests watched films in the Skittle Alley. Hitler issued the directive for Weserübung on 1st March. He knew that the British were preparing to occupy Norway and was anxious to get there first. On the 5th of March, he assembled the senior Wehrmacht commanders for a conference at which Göring learned the details for the first time. He was obviously piqued and attempted, in vain, to get himself involved in the planning stage. He was certainly disappointed, if not actually offended, that Hitler had not entrusted the mission to him. On 1st and 2nd April, after discussing the operation with Falkenhorst, Göring and Raeder, Hitler set 9th April as the date for the occupation. On the 3rd, the first transport steamers set out for the Norwegian coast. Hitler was on tenterhooks in case the British invaded first. The large-scale Kriegsmarine operation began on the night of 6th April. By 8th of April, most naval surface units which could float were at sea with troops aboard and heading for Norway. On the morning of 1st of April, the French and British governments delivered notes to the Norwegian Foreign Ministry advising that they had begun to lay minefields in Norwegian coastal waters. There was great indignation in Oslo. However, this helped justify the measures Hitler had set in train, and so he welcomed it. Next morning, German ambassadors visited the foreign offices in Oslo and Copenhagen and presented demands that the occupation of the two nations respectively be acknowledged. The Danes complied. The German demand to Norway also stated that Quisling would take over the government in Oslo. The King of Norway and his ministers would not bend. The Luftwaffe occupied the airfields at Oslo and Stavanger without difficulty. The invasion of the principal ports from the sea had mixed success. 3 cruisers were sunk. There was a disaster at Narvik, where, after disembarking 2,000 mountain troops under General Dietl's command, 10 German destroyers were bottled up in Narvik Fjord by a superior British naval force. All were sunk. Falkenhorst's Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, set out from Oslo for Trondheim, but were held up by weather and stubborn resistance. The situation was very worrying for Hitler. The German army stood poised west of the Rhine, awaiting the order to strike. Hitler was extremely impatient. Valuable days for his French campaign were being lost. Nervous and at a loss what to do next, he was inclined to evacuate the area around Narvik, and, if necessary, even abandon Trondheim. If the weather over mainland Europe had improved, and a stable system of high pressure had set in, presumably he would have gone ahead in the west at once. His main conversational partner was Jodl, who knew both Narvik and Dietl. The latter was an energetic leader who would succeed in the inhospitable terrain if anybody could. On 14th April, a British force stood 160 kilometres north of Trondheim, and on the 17th they made landings at Andalsnes, 250 kilometres south of the port. Jodl took stock of the situation very calmly. In his opinion, the British had no chance. On 22nd April, Jodl sent his army general staff officer von Lossberg to Norway. At the same time, Schmundt decided to fly to Oslo, since he distrusted Lossberg. They were both back in Berlin by the 24th. Hitler spoke adversely about Lossberg, who was arrogant and had found out practically nothing. Schmundt knew his chief better. His detailed report about the fighting on the road between Oslo and Trondheim put Hitler's mind at rest. On the narrow highway, it was difficult to fight effectively. One just kept on hammering away patiently. There was no doubt that this would eventually succeed. The intervention of the Luftwaffe would be decisive, but the weather was keeping them on the ground. The two British groups had no air support or useful AA weapons. Eventually both were battered by the Luftwaffe operating from Trondheim and suffered heavy losses before pulling out in the first week of May. The stragglers were mopped up as far as Narvik. Meanwhile, the British strengthened their forces elsewhere. Their objective was to cut off the iron ore supply line. It was difficult to reinforce Dietl, and air support from Trondheim was not available, but Dietl nevertheless remained confident and worked day and night at building up his defences. Ultimately, the beginning of the Western offensive caused enemy troop withdrawals and the siege petered out. Once the campaign in the west was in full swing, Hitler took little further interest in the RCE fighting in Norway. On 19th April, against OKH advice, he had sent Josef Terboven, Gauleiter of Essen, to Norway to head the administration, and was evidently relieved on 30th April to be informed by Jodl that communication between Oslo and Trondheim had been restored. On 10th of June, Hitler inserted into the draft OKW final report on the battle for Norway, and especially Narvik, the phrase "in a 2-month-long battle," Austrian mountain troops, Luftwaffe detachments, and our destroyer crews gave for all-time proof of their glorious soldierly qualities. And on the 13th, he sent an order of the day to his soldiers in Norway, thanking the commanders and men for their bravery and self-sacrifice, by means of which they had helped to save the Reich from a great danger. Norway was of great importance for the continuation of the war against Britain. The battle had been a difficult one, and without it, the victorious advance through France could not have been achieved so swiftly. Hitler had dreams of a large-scale development of the port of Trondheim, which would become the most northern German city. The Norwegian campaign highlighted Jodl's qualities. He had made his views known to Hitler quite frankly, and supported him ably during the period of crisis. On the conclusion of fighting, the Führer recognised and praised his role. Hitler valued Jodl as a faithful and devoted staff officer, whose suggestions he often followed in the course of the war. During the battle for Norway, Hitler had concentrated his energies mainly on planning the French campaign, and once summoned army commanders to talks in the Chancellery. On account of his grave suspicions of Brauchitsch and Halder, he came close to ejecting the OKH leadership on several occasions. Only the approach of the great task ahead held him back. Brauchitsch and Halder had forecast heavy fighting in France, which could last for years. Whether this was actually their belief or a ploy to deter Hitler from attacking, I cannot say. Hitler knew that neither could be trusted and inclined to the opinions of army group commanders Lieb, Rundstedt and Bock, who wanted to attack immediately. On 1st May, Hitler set X-Day for the 5th. On 2nd May, he held a conference with Göring and the Luftwaffe leadership about the proposed landings in Fortress Holland. General Student, with whom Hitler had previously discussed the operations against the Hague and the Scheldt estuary, and Graf Sponeck, commanding the Luftlanding Division drops on the Hague and Rotterdam, also took part. Hitler spoke at length to those officers charged with special operations. As what mattered most to him were the element of surprise and quick successes, he laid special stress on these aspects. On 3rd May, the success in Norway and his optimistic view of the French campaign gave Hitler the necessary impetus for his speech in the Sportpalast to 6,000 senior cadets. At the end of it, they knew exactly what was required of them. On the 4th, he delayed X Day until 7 May, and finally at Goering's request until 10th May, but this would be the last postponement, he added. On 9 May, Hitler dictated a proclamation to his soldiers on the Western Front, which ended with the sentence, "The battle which begins today will decide the fate of the German nation for the next 1,000 years. Now do your duty. The German people gives you their blessing." The nearer the fatal hour approached, the calmer and more optimistic Hitler became. It seemed to me that he had shed the doubts which had assailed him during the previous 6 months, and was content to allow events to take their course. He was of the opinion that France would give in after about 6 weeks. It was in fact important that they should do so, since he expected that a quick success would persuade Britain to settle. It would be unimaginable for her to risk losing the empire. Therefore, after the German victory in France, she would sue for peace. On 9th May, the day at last dawned when Hitler could take up residence in his new Führer HQ at the front. Speer had had a castle between Bad Nauheim and Usingen refurbished, but it failed to meet with the Führer's approval, and he had commissioned Todt and Schmundt to locate and refit a new FHQ in the Eifel area further north. It should be as simple as possible. Eventually, Todt found a flak emplacement near Münster Eifel, which would serve after a few modifications. Just before 5 that afternoon, Hitler's special train stood in Berlin-Finkenkrug station, on the main line to Hamburg, a few kilometres west of Staaken Airport. He drove there escorted only by plainclothes detectives and SD men. All other members of the entourage had to get to the station surreptitiously. The train left punctually and set off towards Hamburg. Hitler had announced that we would be visiting troops in Denmark and Norway. I doubt that anybody was taken in by this, for everyone had his private source. A long stop was made at Haguenau Land to take in telephone messages. The tracks were switched, and the train headed for Hanover. The change of direction escaped nobody, and the destination was soon clear. That evening we stopped briefly at Bergdorf near Hanover, where I collected the latest weather forecast. It was satisfactory. Hitler would give his definitive order to open the Western Front next morning. During the journey, Hitler was in sparkling mood, completely confident of victory and devoid of any niggling doubts. The atmosphere at dinner in the buffet car was lively, and he expressed the hope that the preparations in which he had involved himself personally would all go well. In particular, he mentioned the Belgian fort at Eben-Emael. It was already dark when our train pulled into a small station near Euskirchen. 3-axled Mercedes were waiting to convey us to the well-camouflaged Führer HQ Felsenest, a half-hour's drive away. Hitler shared his bunker with Schaub, Keitel and a manservant. A second bunker accommodated Jodl, the 3 military adjutants, Keitel's ADC and Dr. Brandt. There was additionally a dining bunker and a barracks on a slope a short way off. The barracks had been converted into a situation conference room with quarters for Puttkamer, Jodl's ADC, and a sergeant writer. The dining bunker contained a long table with 20 places. Everybody ate here. A map of the entire area to be conquered hung on the long wall. The remainder of the retinue and press officials lodged in a nearby village, where some houses had been requisitioned. X-Day began quietly, and Hitler kept to his bed through the morning. Towards midday, the first sparse reports came in. The bridge at Maastricht had been damaged, but was being quickly repaired. The bridges over the Albert Canal had mostly been taken intact. The glider landings on Eben-Emael had gone off well. Otherwise, there was nothing. Later, it was reported that the Belgian and Dutch military had expected the attack on 10th of May. The date had been betrayed. Nevertheless, resistance everywhere was slight. In some places, the odd bridge had been demolished. Various artificial obstacles held up the initial advance. Elsewhere, the invasion went ahead unhindered. Morale was excellent. Our troops were confident of victory. What the Belgian and Dutch were offering amounted only to delaying tactics. That the French army was in a difficult position, They had expected the attack from the north through Belgium and were having to manoeuvre awkwardly to engage. On the whole, the opposition was no match for our panzers and Luftwaffe. This was obvious during the first 10 days. The Dutch army capitulated on 14th May. Owing to a signals breakdown, the planned air attack on Rotterdam could not be aborted and went ahead after the surrender had been accepted. The city received appalling damage, with heavy casualties amongst the civilian population. Belgium gave in on 24th May, the instrument of unconditional surrender being signed 4 days later. The Belgian king elected to remain with his people. A deplorable bulletin was issued following an accidental calamity on 10th of May. The town of Freiburg im Breisgau was bombed. People had been killed and property seriously damaged. The official investigation found that German aircraft were responsible. A squadron had orders to attack a French town west of the Rhine, but 2 machines had gone astray and attacked Freiburg in error. Hitler was informed and ordered that the matter be kept quiet. Unfortunately, the propaganda ministry got hold of it and turned the affair into an Allied terror raid. The German main thrust rumbled down through difficult terrain, and by 12th May had reached the Meuse at Dinant. On the 20th, the spearhead of Guderian's 19th Army Corps was at Amiens and Abbeville on the Somme estuary, a spectacular success. Eben Emael had surrendered on the 11th. A special type of explosive had been used for the first time to crack the nut. Hitler invited the victorious team to FHQ, where the 2 commanders were decorated with the Knight's Cross, after which they described to him the proceedings in depth. On 14th May, I wrote to my uncle, Otto von Below. The first 4 to 5 days of this campaign have been more successful than the Führer, army or Luftwaffe could have dreamed. Everywhere our bombers have been uncannily successful against the enemy air forces and armies. The enemy air force is already down to 60% of his starting numbers. Our massed motorised units have not been attacked at all. The crossings and bridgeheads on the Meuse at Dinant and Sedan were quickly secured. British troops and parts of the French army have moved into the Brussels-Ghent-Courtrai area, having failed to divine our intentions or identify the main thrust. The army is poised to strike its surprise blow. I suggested it to you at Christmas. We have reached the starting point.